Good evening. It's Friday, June 21st, 2013. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I'm proud to be hosting tonight's live webcast from LaRouchePAC.com. Tonight we're joined by, of course, Mr. LaRouche in the studio, as we are every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time for our regular series of live webcasts. And I'll also be joined tonight by Leandra Bernstein, who will be asking a series of questions along with myself. Now, we have a question which has come in from an institutional contact in Washington, and Mr. LaRouche has requested that we begin with the presentation of that question. So I'd like to ask Leandra to come to the podium to present that question.
All right, before I read that question, I think it's important for our viewers to know that in Delaware, just at the end of this week, there was a very heavy-handed intervention by none other than J.P. Morgan into the passage of a simple resolution at the state level, in the state legislature in Delaware. In the Delaware Senate Banking Committee on Thursday, the State Senate Resolution number 9 came up to be voted on, and it was sponsored by Senator Ennis, calling on the U.S. Congress to reinstate Glass-Steagall, pass H.R. 129. Now, in the course of the discussion of this resolution, Senator Ennis cited the 66 years in which Glass-Steagall was a law, leading into its repeal, which led directly to the 2008 crisis. In the course of his remarks, he made multiple references to the prospect of bail-in coming to the United States, from Cyprus to the United States. All of a sudden, in this hearing, a representative of the Mid-Atlantic Financial Services Association intervened to say it would be unwise to pass this resolution, and that it should be tabled, and it should be subject to, there should be extensive further discussion about what really caused the crisis of 2008. Then a representative from J.P. Morgan intervened to say it is very inadvisable for Delaware, of all states, to pass this resolution at this time. Now, it should be noted that Delaware is, in fact, the home of a very large banking industry, and it was an interesting experience for members of this committee in the Delaware Senate to come into the room to have it filled with bank lobbyists. And the LaRouche PAC organizer who was working on this state noted that usually you only have hearings on a bill. This is just a resolution. This didn't involve the resolution to call on Congress to reinstate Glass-Steagall. Did not require the changing of any law. It didn't involve spending any money. But still, the House was packed with these banking lobbyists. So there was a very heated back and forth between the main sponsor of the bill and the representative from J.P. Morgan, who noted that similar resolutions, his intervention against Glass-Steagall was to say that similar resolutions have been introduced in 17 states, but only passed in 3. So clearly he has not been following the LaRouche PAC website, the Glass-Steagall page, otherwise he'd know that it has been introduced in 22 states and passed in 4. And then he went on, the debate went on, and to each intervention the senator made, there was a retort from the banking industry, except on the issue of bail-in. Now, we'll get to the history of J.P. Morgan in just a minute in the institutional question where this is brought up. But it is notable that in J.P. Morgan executive Jamie Dimon's, the anteroom to his office, there's the brace of pistols used originally in the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And the legacy of J.P. Morgan is one of immense treason, with the original incarnation of J.P. Morgan being the Manhattan Company, which was the swindle that Aaron Burr pulled on the state of New York City when the National Bank wouldn't give him the money to start a counter bank. But I just want to throw into the mix another element on J.P. Morgan before we get directly to the question. This week, a 16-page report from J.P. Morgan was taken to the public with quotes from this report saying that the problem with Europe and the problem with further banking integration in Europe is that they have gone away from the fascist constitutions of pre-World War II and gone to democratic constitutions. This report, they stated, the constitutions and political settlements in the southern periphery of Europe put in place in the aftermath of the fall of fascism have a number of features which appear to be unsuited to further integration in the region. So again, this from J.P. Morgan. But to get to the question, the questioner asks, Mr. LaRouche, this week a lobbyist for J.P. Morgan Chase appeared before the Delaware State Senate to argue against a resolution calling on the House and Senate delegates to support the reinstating of Glass-Steagall bills now before the House and Senate in H.R. 129 and S. 985. The fact that J.P. Morgan, which was the architect of the repeal of Glass-Steagall beginning in 1984, came out publicly in their own name to attempt to block the passage of the Delaware resolution is indicative of the fact that the fight for Glass-Steagall is reaching a tipping point. The population has no stomach for bankers, the bailouts did nothing for the real economy, and now J.P. Morgan has made the decision that they must step in openly to defend the repeal and the consequences. Back in 1984, it was a J.P. Morgan task force chaired by Alan Greenspan and including William Dudley, the current president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, that spelled out the strategy for repealing the 1933 law, breaking up the Depression-era too-big-to-fail banks. When Greenspan was appointed as chairman of the Fed in '87, he put all of his weight behind the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which finally occurred in '99. Is it your view that the emergence of J.P. Morgan in the Delaware hearing in such an open effort to block the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall is an indication that we have now entered the beginning of the final battle for Glass-Steagall? Are we at the tipping point where the enemies of Glass-Steagall had no choice but to come out openly in defense of a policy that has had devastating consequences for the overwhelming majority of Americans?
Okay. The situation is such that despite the fact that for some long period of time, even during the course of this year to date, that the opposition to what J.P. Morgan represents was considered a loser. That has changed, and that is the crucial change. That J.P. Morgan came out with all full fists and so forth to show this thing indicates that they are frightened. And because we do have, in the U.S. population, to the surprise of many members of the Congress, we do have a trend, an accelerating trend, toward Glass-Steagall. Now, people generally in the United States don't really know what Glass-Steagall is. They do know some of the things it means, and those things are very clear, and that is sufficient to motivate them. The point is that from my standpoint, they do not really understand what is going on, but they understand enough to be right. And they are, this confidence is rising up in them, is manifesting itself. And only very, very dirty tricks could at this point really stop Glass-Steagall. In any ordinary kind of process in the U.S. Congress, Glass-Steagall would win. The temperament is for that. And the enemies of Glass-Steagall know it. And that's what the significance is of the event this past week. Now, this goes further. When I say that very few Americans understand what the bottom issue really is, because the point is that what J.P. Morgan represents and the international bailout system and its likeness, it is hopelessly bankrupt. It could never survive. It could never come back to life. The ratio of debt, which is, we're talking about trillions of dollars of worthless debt, and there's no sign that it will ever improve. As a matter of fact, it will not under them. What they would tend to do, obviously, means that they know this. J.P. Morgan does have a few pieces of competence. It does know what's going on around its business. It has no intention of ever finding an equitable resolution of the bankruptcy of the international monetarist system. The entire transatlantic system of monetarism is hopelessly bankrupt. We're talking about quadrillions of dollars of these banks. They are absolutely worthless. They will never repay. They never could. They never intended to. What they intend is obviously dictatorship. Now, from our standpoint, what's the situation? People do not understand Glass-Steagall fully. They understand Glass-Steagall. They like it. They're right in what their opinion is on this. They don't know the deeper issue. Deeper issue is that under the U.S. Constitution, the original U.S. Constitution, and its laws, we do not have a banking system in the ordinary sense as a national banking system. We have a credit system. Now, this was a difficult question that came up in terms of Alexander Hamilton. The other representatives did not understand how to deal with this thing. Here we had U.S. debt, war debts to many nations, or nations that assisted us in getting our freedom. But the idea of how are we going to pay the debts that we had incurred in defending ourselves against the British Empire. And Alexander Hamilton came up with a solution. It was the obvious solution. It had been there before. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had already had an intention in this direction, which some people remembered. And even though the Massachusetts Bay Colony was crushed by the Anglo-Dutch interests, and the Dutch played a key role in this operation, some people forgot the lesson of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Hamilton came up with it. We do not believe in the kind of banking system as a national banking system that these jokers believe in. And most people would more or less tend to accept it unless they were very angry and being cheated. Then that would change their viewpoint. Our system is a credit system. Our system is not a monetary system. It's a credit system. The assumption is, as Hamilton laid this out, is we have a program under which we grow the economy. We increase the productive powers of labor. In other words, we don't try to balance the budget, we unbalance the budget. We have a budgetary plan, a national plan of management, under which we do nothing unless we're going to grow the economy. And therefore, the money that the United States government puts up as credit in the name of the United States government is intended to grow. It's not to go more deeply into debt. Yes, we go into debt, but we do it by growing more rapidly than we go into debt. And that's the way the system worked. That's what Franklin Roosevelt did before the war actually started. That was his intention. That's been our intention. We are not a monetarist system. And the problem is that every nation of Europe is based on a monetarist system, which is essentially the British Empire, the European system of imperialism. We are not. We are a unique nation. There are some nations that have tried to imitate us and so forth. That's good, highly recommended if they know how to do it. But the point is, the idea is that the federal government backs up credit, which is created through the federal system. This credit is then used to fund the growth of the economy through productivity. For example, in the old system, you would have a situation in the United States in which the farmers would be in debt in order to farm. Then, when the farmers had sold what they had to sell and made an income, then the turn went now to the manufacturers and similar kinds of people. So the idea is that the federal government gives credit, but it organizes the giving of credit. But the credit is always based on growth, physical and related growth of the economy, increase of the productive powers of labor, unlike any European system. Now, what these clowns have from J.P. Morgan and Company is they have no way that they could ever bail out, actually, in an endgame, this issue. If we do not get Glass-Steagall now, if we do not pass Glass-Steagall now, the United States will be destroyed because it will be a victim of a dictatorship which had to cancel quadrillions of dollars of debt that it could never pay and never intended to pay. So when J.P. Morgan comes in, considering what they know about their business, one would have to say that unless they've suddenly gone stupid and lost the idea of what their intentions are, they're finished. But if we don't get in Glass-Steagall, we're finished too. And if we win, if we get Glass-Steagall, J.P. Morgan and banks like it will never again appear on the surface of this planet. So the job is get this thing through fast. The American people are ready for it. They need it. It's the only hope we have. We have to create more employment. We have to create income and producing employment for the nation. We have to go back to the principle of Alexander Hamilton. And that's our system. We're going back to it. And we can promise the people of this nation that if Glass-Steagall is put through now, considering the kind of temperament the nation has to have in order to get Glass-Steagall through, we're going to have the greatest recovery that mankind has ever known.
Now, on the subject of dirty tricks, on the subject of dictatorship, I want to ask a relevant follow-on question. Obviously, the last two and a half weeks have been dominated by the revelations that have come from Edward Snowden, other whistleblowers, what's been published in The Guardian, what's been published in The Washington Post. And every step along the way, Obama and his compatriots have tried to deny what has been exposed, only to be exposed once again as being liars every step along the way. Now, what this surveillance operation is really in its essence, is nothing but a national and international system of blackmail that would make J. Edgar Hoover's operation pale in comparison. There's several indications of this that I can point out. First, as was exposed last week, going all the way back to the G20 summit in London in 2009, the NSA was working together with the British NSA, the GCHQ, to wiretap and monitor the communications of every single head of state and their entire retinue that came along with them to that London G20 summit. Now, this was exposed in leaks from Edward Snowden, and it was exposed that their computers, their phone calls were all being monitored on the instructions of the British government, of David Cameron and others. Some delegates were even tricked into using fake internet cafes that had been set up by the British host intelligence services to read their email traffic. Dmitry Medvedev, the then president of Russia, was one of the number one heads of state to be targeted for this surveillance. Now, what's fascinating is to realize that this entire surveillance operation in the G20 summit in 2009 was intended as a way to bludgeon these leaders into passing the bailout and, as we know now, the bail-in, to make that the agenda in response to the 2007-2008 crisis, as opposed to what should have been enacted all the way back then, which was Glass-Steagall. This was indicated in a FOTSET column at the beginning of this week, describing exactly how Gordon Brown asked the British intelligence services to do this operation in order to make sure that he had a leg up to push through his bailout agenda. And in fact, it's written right into the British Intelligence Services Act in Section 1 that their intelligence services have a mandate to operate not only in the interests of national security, but also in the interests of the economic well-being of the United Kingdom. So you have that. You also have the questions domestically that Senator Kirk asked Eric Holder when he first appeared to testify on this NSA wiretapping. Senator Kirk put Holder on the spot and said, "Tell me this, did you ever monitor the telephone communications of sitting members of the U.S. Congress?" And Holder sort of issued a non-denial denial. And Kirk hit him on that and said, look, the right answer would have been absolutely not. That would be against the Constitution and the separation of powers. Now, this has been confirmed. Senator Kirk's suspicions have been confirmed just this week in an interview that was conducted with Russell Tice, who is a very credible and well-known source because he was the source of the original 2005 leaks to the New York Times exposing the original Bush warrantless wiretapping program. He's former Air Force intelligence and former NSA. Now, what Russell Tice said was really explosive. This is an interview. He said, I had my hands, when I worked at the NSA, literally on the paperwork for these sorts of things. They went after high-ranking military officers. They went after members of Congress, both the Senate and the House, especially on the intelligence committees, the armed services committees, and the judiciary committees. They went after lawyers and law firms. They went after judges, including one of which is now sitting on the Supreme Court. He said, I had his wiretap information in my hand. He said 2 of them are former FISA court judges. They went after State Department officials. They went after people in the executive service that were part of the White House, their own people. They went after anti-war groups. They went after U.S. companies that do international business. They went after U.S. banking firms that do international business. They went after NGOs like the Red Cross, who go overseas and do humanitarian work. They went after anti-war civil rights groups. So don't tell me that there's no abuse, because I've had this stuff in my hand and I've looked at it. So this report obviously confirms not only what Senator Kirk's suspicions were, but also other reports that we've received from insiders on Capitol Hill along similar lines. And the interviewer correctly pointed out at this point in the interview, this creates the basis and the potential for massive blackmail. And then Russell Tice drops the big bomb. He says, absolutely. And here's the big one. This was in the summer of 2004. One of the papers I held in my hand was a wiretap of a bunch of numbers associated with a 40-something-year-old wannabe senator from Illinois. You wouldn't happen to know where that guy lives right now, would you? It's a big white house in Washington, D.C. That's who they went after, and that's the President of the United States now. So this, as I said, goes deeper than J. Edgar Hoover ever could have dreamed. This is the control apparatus of the British Empire globally and within the United States. And I think that this corresponds directly with the reason why many members of Congress might be a little skittish to stand up courageously to J.P. Morgan and this crowd in the fight for Glass-Steagall. So maybe your comments on this.
Well, I think it goes a little deeper than that. I mean, I know, for example, that these considerations are there. But I also know that we have a long-standing record of gutlessness among leading officials, elected and others of our nation. I've seen it all the way through. I've been the target of it, and I've also been a target of targeting it at the same time. And this goes back essentially, I would say, well, back to 1971, about that time as I began to play the game against this sort of crap. So this is not new to me at all. And what I've seen is well, look, take the case of Bush. Now, the original Bush in this connection was actually funded Adolf Hitler's promotion in Germany. And more than that, the whole crowd, including leading figures in Britain, were guilty of cahoots with Hitler. Now what happened, there was a change where things weren't working out too well, and so they came up with a different solution, the Churchill solution. And Churchill begged for, Franklin Roosevelt to save the British Union. But also at the same time, what was done as we began to win the war, what happened is the British monarchy did everything possible to prevent President Franklin Roosevelt from proceeding with what he could have accomplished, that is to move in on France, on the south of France and north of France, and lead in to just crack the whole Nazi thing at the point it was ready to be cracked. That was postponed until the point that Roosevelt died. And only after Roosevelt died did the British monarchy allow the victory over Hitler. And this is what the Bush family represents. The Bush family has been part of this process all the way through. That's only an example. I mean, Cheney is Cheney. One of the worst. Young Bush, one of the dumbest, but also nasty. And then we got this other thing, Obama, who's a complete stooge. So what's happened is you had a defeat after defeat since the assassinations of the Kennedy brothers. Defeat after defeat of the United States from people inside the United States who were in cahoots with this British crowd. And the Bush family is one of the worst. The Bush family has a Hitler pedigree. It's well known. How many times was Bush either vice president, either a vice president or a president? And look at the record of what they did as those presidents. Look at the change. Now you had also Bush was a vice president at a crucial point on the question of the SDI. And Bush, though he's not such a smart guy, he never was, but he's a Bush of this crowd. And that was another factor. Many of the problems I had with in that period, in the 1980s, was entirely a matter of Bush. It was a Bush operation. And even the president himself at that time was unable to control that situation. So what's the sum up of this? The United States has been the victim of the British Empire repeatedly, 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 and repeatedly. The Anglo-Dutch Empire, which was established in that period. And we never really beat it. We did beat them back again and again and again. But you have to take the number of presidents who were assassinated under British orders. Lincoln is only one example of this. Kennedy, John Kennedy, was a victim of this. And now, even now, they pretend to not to treat it so seriously anymore. But it was a frame. It was afraid of it. It was a murder of a president. And they murdered the brother who was going to run for president at that same time. And from that point on, at the exact break point, we were drawn into a war which was totally unnecessary, the Indochina War. And we had Douglas MacArthur, the greatest general that the United States ever had, directly, in terms of skill, said, don't do it. And the only way they got the United States to go to the war in Indochina was by killing John F. Kennedy as president. And there were a lot of people in important places, including, say, from California, a governor from California, who played a key part in this. So you had an assassination of a president, John F. Kennedy, in order to get us into a war, which the best advisor on military affairs said no. The president said no, so they killed the president. So the problem is this nation of ours has been the target of the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire, for all of this time. And there have been many incidents that have occurred in this process. And when you talk about the weakness of members of the Congress, weakness of members of other officials, and so forth, you have to understand one thing. A lot of presidents have been killed, always by the British. And you have in the United States the Wall Street gang, which was all a treasonous crowd from the beginning. British bankers controlled the United States from on. So that's where we stand. The question is, we've come to a time where the situation is so bad that the usual cowardice and cringing cowardice of our leading officials, out of cowardice, their career depends upon being a coward. It depends on this kind of thing. The time has come where we have to get our guts together and do very simple things. In this case, the mere passage of Glass-Steagall, if it's passed with understanding of what it really means, the Hamiltonian principle, then we can get our country back. Now, on the other hand, if we don't do this, what is looking at us now is not an Indochina war, it's thermonuclear war. And everyone, including like General Dempsey and so forth, are talking about preventing the United States from being dragged in very soon into a thermonuclear war. Now, a thermonuclear war means that from beginning to end, about an hour and a half, the extinction of the human species has virtually occurred. You cannot have a nuclear war, to be a thermonuclear war, now. You cannot have such a war. What does it mean if you're going to take on China and Russia? What does that mean? Are they going to surrender simply because you've got nuclear weapons? Absolutely not. 1.2 or more billion Chinese are not going to cave in that easily. Not when they have the weapons they have. Russia will not cave in. Other nations will not cave in. So if we're going to have a nation, if we're going to have a world perhaps to live in, What we need right now is nothing as much as a reenactment immediately of Glass-Steagall.
This next question is very much along the lines of what you just indicated. It pertains both to the revolt against Obama from within on the NSA spying, but most especially on Syria, and what's being said by knowledgeable sources about what the outcome of such action in Syria would be. Let me start with saying, as we reported last week, the party lines are fracturing around the NSA spying situation. Indicative of this is a bill that was introduced by Congressman Justin Amash, a Republican, and Congressman John Conyers, a Democrat. This was highlighted at a press conference that occurred on Capitol Hill last week. But on Syria, you have a similar impulse. There were only three senators, who voted against arming the rebels in Syria. But these three senators were two Democrats and one Republican, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, Tom Udall, and Rand Paul. And they said, what's the end game in this? Is this a second Iraq? Is this a second Afghanistan? Is this even worse? And now those three senators plus one more, Mike Lee from Utah, have introduced legislation to prohibit this president from providing arms for the rebels in Syria, especially without any sort of congressional debate. Tom Udall said, we have to check the president's unilateral decision to arm the rebels. We should not be involved in another civil war in the Middle East without a clear national security interest. Mike Lee said any military involvement in Syria, including the arming of Syrian rebels, needs to be authorized through Congress, where concerns can be publicly debated and the American people have their say. Chris Murphy said, I'm deeply skeptical about plans for military intervention in Syria, given the dangerously fractured state of the opposition and the very real risk of American weapons and money falling into the hands of the same terrorist organizations that we're fighting around the world. We should be extremely wary of allowing the United States to be drawn into such a proxy war. At the very least, the American people deserve a full and honest debate before we make the commitment to fall into another deep, dark hole once again. And Senator Rand Paul said, the president's unilateral decision to arm Syrian rebels is incredibly disturbing. Engaging in yet another conflict in the Middle East with no vote or congressional oversight compounds the severity of this situation. The American people deserve real deliberation before we send arms to a region rife with extremists who seek to threaten the U.S. and her allies. Now, I think a little bit more to the point, even though, is a column that was written this Wednesday by Paul Craig Roberts, who's a known personality. He was the Assistant Secretary of Treasury under the Reagan administration. And he identifies that at the point that the Obama administration began even speaking about red lines in Syria, chemical weapons, anybody who knew anything, everyone with a brain, immediately knew that Washington would fabricate false intelligence that Assad had used chemical weapons, just as Washington presented to the UN the vile lie via Secretary of State Colin Powell that Saddam Hussein had dangerous weapons of mass destruction. He said, remember Condi Rice's image of a mushroom cloud over American cities? So then he goes on to say that the Russians certainly knew that Washington was lying. And he summarizes statements by Sergei Lavrov, Alexei Pushkov, and President Putin himself, and then continues by saying, Washington, under Obama, is going to push its agenda to the point of starting World War III, which of course means the end of life on Earth. Russia and China, either one of which can destroy the United States, are protesting Washington's assault on Syria that Washington pretends is a civil war. If Syria falls, Russia and China know that Iran is next. Both Russia and China know that after Iran falls, they are next. There is no other explanation for Washington surrounding Russia with missile bases and surrounding China with naval and air bases. Both Russia and China are now preparing for the war that they see as inevitable. Washington is bringing unsuspecting Americans up against two countries with hydrogen bombs, whose combined population is 5 times the U.S. population. In such a conflict, everyone dies. And then he concludes, ironically, considering the utterly insane government ruling in Washington, if human life exists in 2020, it will be a miracle. All the worry about future Medicare and Social Security deficits is meaningless. There will be no one here to collect the benefits. So I would like your response to that. Is this a fair assessment? And I think it also corresponds very closely with remarks that Vladimir Putin himself made, not only about the inadvisability of giving guns to cannibals, but also what he understands as the intention to knock out Russia's second strike capability.
Well, first of all, let's get to the basics, because it's a complicated story, and one has to get essentially to the basics in order to get what the picture is. All right, the problem is, let's go back to the period of the Great Renaissance. And we had a great person, Nicholas Cusa, the greatest genius probably in all modern history. And it was he, Cusa, he was in he died in 10, 20, 30, 40 years before the end of the decade. But in his process, he committed himself and committed his associates to cross the oceans, and this meant in particular the Atlantic Ocean, in order to create a situation in which the hopelessness of Europe, the imperialism of Europe, which made Europe hopeless, incapable of getting out of the cycle, which goes back to the most evil kinds of ancient forms of government. And so Cusa established the principle, we must cross the waters because the situation is in Europe in particular, is hopeless. They are morally incapable of solving their own problems. So therefore we must cross the waters into other continents and build up an alternative to this kind of Roman Empire kind of system in order to save civilization generally. He was also probably the greatest scientific genius of his time. And his followers and associates were, for example, Kepler. Kepler was probably one of the greatest geniuses in physical science that ever walked the earth, even though there are funny remarks about him here and there. So the point is, we've come to a point that we have to realize we cannot talk about arguments among nations. How can you talk about arguments among nations or peace treaties and so forth when this kind of thing is going on, when you're going on with thermonuclear war, a war that can, depopulate the planet within about an hour and a half, or at least set the motion in that will cause that to happen. And we're debating these kinds of things. The problem has been the existence of imperialism, as we call it today, which has been, in its time, has passed from various hands, but for a long time has been British, the British Empire. The British Empire was always our enemy. It was our enemy before we existed. And now this empire, which has now declared itself the proprietor of all Europe, declared the United States merely as a colony of this European system of the British. This thing that rules everything, that takes your food away for gambling purposes, is starving our own people to death for gambling purposes. And we are allowing this thing. This is our enemy. This is the enemy of humanity. It's the enemy of everything we ever stood for. And we have to defeat it. We're not going to go into a thermonuclear war. That's not our intention. We don't want any such nonsense. What we want is simply to crush the intention of the worst mass murderers that ever slid over the surface of the earth. And we have to get our own people to understand. Stop getting into this discussion. Stop this nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. You're being starved to death. Your food is being taken away from you to make gasoline or whatever. Our people are going to die at an accelerating rate now. It's already started. The British Queen has declared that her intention is to reduce the human population from 7 billion people to approximately 1 within a relatively short period of time. She's extending that policy and has, the British Empire, always in Africa. Africa is a target of mass murder of Africans. They're now starting to start a war with China. It is a war. It's the British Empire. You have to understand what the nature is of the evil which is embodied in this empire. And you have to be almost throw up to think of the list of American leaders who are admirers and cooperators with the British Empire. Mankind, the things that have happened to mankind in various parts of the world, based on this empire, which was the Roman Empire at one point, and now it's the British Empire. You have to understand this is something that has to be checked. That civilized life cannot go on while this is happening. And what people do is they talk gobbledygook. The issues come up. The issues are clear. And what do people discuss? Gobbledygook. Well, maybe this, well, maybe that, this sort of nonsense. The time has come that the survival of humanity depends in part on our ability and that of others of a like mind to fix this thing now, quickly. The first thing we have to do is the United States itself. Because if we fix the United States and get the rottenness that's killing us out of our system, we can succeed in bringing the majority of nations together to bring this horror show to an end.
Well, since you brought up the issue of the biofuels or biofoolery, I would like to ask you a question on the use of food for fuel, the biofuels mandate, which you said in a recent discussion, you indicated that this is what we as a political action committee and also we as society need to defeat immediately. Now, we've discussed on this program and in other publications the impact of the biofuels mandate on cattle herds, on livestock, on prices, really pricing food out of consumers' reach, and with the government subsidies now going to ethanol, where it takes approximately 1.3 gallons of gasoline energy, regular gasoline energy, to produce 1 gallon of ethanol, you're going to quickly price people out of energy also. But one thing that we have not had as clearly as we have it currently is the actual death rate as a result of the biofuels mandate. And recently, Michael Kirsch, the author of the North American Water and Power Alliance proposal, and Marcia Mary Baker, who works with Executive Intelligence Review on these sorts of issues, found from 2011 a press release from an individual who works with the U.S. Department of Interior, Indore Goklani. I doubt I'm pronouncing his name properly. But in this press release, he indicated, based on World Health Organization statistics, the number of people dying annually is, as a result of the biofuels mandate, increasing from 2004 levels, is 200,000 people per year die as a result of the increase in the biofuels mandate from 2004 levels. Now, Marcia Mary Baker did a rough estimate of what that, using the calculations from this individual, who is he's a very interesting fellow. He wrote a book titled "Why Global Warming Policies Are More Dangerous Than Global Warming Itself," which gets to the point there. But what Marcia Mary Baker pulled together is that, on a conservative estimate, based on extrapolating the calculations done for this 2011 statistic, we can see the death of 250,000 people per year, and millions more afflicted with disease and disability as a result of. And since Obama has become president, you've seen a 35% increase in the volume of corn going toward ethanol, from 94 million tons in 2008 to 127 million tons in 2011. Now, that's your death count. That's per year. 250,000 people, 250,000 people per year dying as a result of this. The Pope Francis, made a statement Thursday condemning speculation and what he's called the dictatorship of the economy, blaming speculation for the food crisis, saying it's a well-known fact that current levels of production are sufficient, yet millions of people are still suffering and dying of starvation. This is truly scandalous. And he goes on to say, a way has to be found to enable everyone to benefit from the fruits of the earth, and not simply to close the gap between the affluent and those who must be satisfied with the crumbs falling from the table. Now, as part of a move to destroy this biofuels mandate, there was a piece of legislation introduced by Senator Goodlatte of Virginia, with bipartisan support, calling for the repeal of the Renewable Fuel Standard. The Renewable Fuel Standard Elimination Act of 2013. I'm sorry, Representative Goodlatte. And there was a press conference on Thursday bringing this issue back to the fore with the Food Fairness Coalition. And I mean, this is a bill that has very substantial bipartisan support, and it was just brought back onto the front burner, so to speak, with this press conference. But without saying any more, because there will be much more coverage of this on the website, I would like to get your views on how we're going to destroy the biofuels mandate and the consequences of not doing it.
Well, there's a question and answer. Both are involved in this matter. Because the Queen of England, who is actually the #1 figure in the global system, that is, she is nominally and functionally actually the empress of the world. And with her gobbling up the United States, which has happened under Obama and was happening under the 2 terms of Bush and so forth, and all the Bush things that have happened to the United States earlier, have all in this same direction. And the Bushes are only typical of a whole crew of people in the United States and elsewhere who have this kind of policy. And the policy is to reduce, the Queen was the one who was the leader in this thing, and it's still her policy, is to reduce the human population from 7 billion people to approximately 1 at a fairly rapid rate. Now, what is happening now is a result of that policy of the Queen of England. Now, she's not just the Queen of England. She is actually an empress. You take the number of nations which are literally under her control. You take the policies that are introduced under her specific influence. The green policy is that policy. It's a policy of reduction of the human population by what means? Any means available. And that's the Queen's policy. And she is an empress, not a queen. She's an empress. She's moved into the United States on big time. And as long as you allow that to go on unchallenged, you have no chance at all. The possibility of the existence of the human species is called into question. And that's what that food policy is. If you allow that to go through, if you don't stop that, if you don't throw that out, if you don't take that out and burn it, get rid of it, the policy is itself criminal. It's a plan for mass murder by various means, starving people to death. The rate of starvation in the United States now, do you realize what that is? Do you realize what that means in terms of the food that people are not going to have? Do you realize the increase in the death rate if you allow this president to continue with his present policies? And he's only working for the Queen. But her intention is to reduce the population of the planet from 9 billion people, or 7 billion people, down to approximately 1. And she's doing it already. It's being done. It's what the green movement is. This is the worst thing in all known history. Not necessarily in magnitude. The magnitude is bigger, but in terms of intensity. This is the greatest evil that you can imagine. And if anyone is apologizing for that, what are their morals? They don't have any.
Well, we have come to the end of our allotted time. That will bring a conclusion to our webcast tonight. I want to thank Leandra for joining me tonight. I thank our technical staff for the support, and I thank Mr. LaRouche for being with us. Thank you all of you for watching, and we'll see you next week.